Hello everyone, my name is Nicholas Furman. I am a 3D artist freelancer / video game developer, and today I'm going to be talking about 3D hard surface modeling. Now you see this stuff everywhere. It's in games, it's in movies, it's in television, it's in 3D animation of course, and well, it's pretty awesome. And if you look out on the internet, there's a lot of different examples of very specific ways to manipulate 3D models, but no one ever really takes the time to explain the fundamentals. And today I'm going to demystify some of the concepts behind 3D hard surface modeling. Now it shouldn't matter which program you're using for this, be it Blender or Cinema 4D, Maya, Max, Modo, or Houdini. All the concepts should be the same and you should be able to apply these wherever you go. So let's get started. Alright, now before we continue, I'm just going to go over the things that we're going to be discussing in this video. We're going to start with some terminology, just some really basic vocabulary that you need to know before you start modeling. Because you're going to run into these sort of concepts again and again and again as you move between 3D programs or navigate the one of your choice. Then we're going to move on to some universal principles, things like poly count, things like edge poles and ngons and edge flow. And then after that, I'm going to help you decide on a software that best suits your purposes, because each one is tailored to specific tasks that are really quite superior to others. Okay, so first we're going to start off with some vocabulary, and I've broken this up into two different sections, one for 3D models and their components, and then one to transformations. And while the transformations are fairly straightforward, you just have three, your transform, rotate, and scale. With 3D models, I'm going to be starting with the smallest component and then working my way out to the largest component. So that would start with the vertex, up to edges, up to faces, to meshes, and then objects. Now again, with the 3D model, it can be broken down into its component pieces. Every model will always consist of these pieces. We'll start with the smallest one here. This is the vertex. Now a vertex, it's really simple. All it is in a 3D space is just a point. And that point has three values, an X value, a Y value, and a Z value. Now for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to show you a 2D graph and how it would work on there. And we can just simply transfer this over to a third dimension when we get over into our 3D program. But for now, a vertex is just a point in 3D space. Next we have edges. Now edges are just lines that connect two vertices. And with enough edges and enough vertices, we find that there's going to be a little gap in between all of them. And in this gap is where we would place the surface known as a face or a polygon. Now, faces are really important for your work. Faces are going to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the visual information that people will see whenever they're looking at your model. Now, that won't really come into play until you get to the texturing phase, but it's important to know nonetheless. Now, moving up from there, it's mostly just a collection of faces, and we call this collection of faces a mesh. And all an object is a collection of meshes. Now, this is an important distinction to make early on, because I didn't really understand this until a little bit into my studies with 3D. A mesh has to have connective faces between them, whereas an object does not. An object can have multiple meshes within it, with edges and vertices and faces that don't connect, but a mesh must always have these components. So now that we have all of our components understood and laid out, let's talk about how we can transform those components as a 3D modeler. Okay, so we're going to move over to one of our 3D programs to demonstrate these concepts. The one I use most often is called the Autodesk Maya. So here in Maya, we have just a clearly laid out triangle, and all we have is two axes to work with. We have the x-axis and the y-axis going up and down. So let's talk about our component pieces first. Let's look at the vertex. You can see this triangle clearly has three vertices. It has three edges. And it has a single face. Now this whole thing by itself, even though it's small, consists of a mesh. If we had more pieces connected to it, that would still be the same mesh, but this is all part of the same object. Okay, so let's talk about the ways that we can move this thing around. Starting off, of course, with translation. Translation, again, just moves these things along an axis, so we can move in the positive x direction. Whoops, sorry, still in pivot mode. We can move this in the positive x direction. We can move this in the negative X direction. Move it in the positive Y, and the negative Y. And that's basically all translation is we're just moving the pieces around. But if we were to do this in, say, one of our component modes here, like the vertex, then you'll see, actually let me turn off grid snap real quick. You'll see that we can actually move this independent of the other pieces. And essentially that's a lot of what the modeling job looks like, is you moving around vertices, but there are special functions we can use, and I'll get to those later. But after that, we have the rotation. Rotation obviously just rotates this around an axis or a single point. You can move that however you like. And last, we'll have the scale tool. And all scaling does, obviously, is increases the volume of the object. We can scale it up, we can scale it down, we can do whatever we need to get the shape that we want, but it will always scale from that point where that pivot is there. And the pivot, when I keep saying that, is that little point at the center where this little tool originates. We can move that around, but that's stuff for another time. Alright, and moving back into our presentation here. You'd be surprised how much of the modeling process can be accomplished just through those 3 actions alone. But we do need specialized tools to help us get sort of the shapes that we need. And I'll be going through those at some point. Right now it's kind of out of the scope of the video, and plus it depends on which software you're using. Each of them has different tools that allow you to do a lot of the same functions or even different functions from other programs. But again, that's for a different time. So now that a lot of that simple stuff's out of the way, let's start talking about a few of the more advanced things that you'll need to know, and things that you're going to run into as a 3D modeler in terms that you're going to hear online from other YouTubers, or simply wherever your 3D modeling journey takes you. Now again, I've divided these into 2 sections because I think they're worth separating into 2 different pieces. The first one's contained within the modeling process itself. These are your basic terms, things like topology, edge flow, z-fighting / lamina faces, ngons, edge poles, and poly count. Whereas the second section talks about different parts of the 3D modeling process. Actually, these are outside of 3D modeling, but can be accomplished within the same software that you'll be using to do 3D modeling. Regardless, whether you're working as a freelancer or someone who intends to work for a company someday, these are extremely important terms for you to know. And I'm going to try and break them down into their simplest terms so that you can understand them and understand what is going to be done to your models moving forward after the 3D modeling process. But first, let's go over some universal concepts, the first of which is topology. You're going to hear this word thrown around a lot, and at its simplest terms, all topology refers to is how a mesh is constructed. Now, there are good ways to construct a mesh, and there are bad ways to construct a mesh. Some of these other terms that you see on the list sort of help define what makes a good mesh versus what makes a bad mesh, or what makes bad topology. And the first of these I'm going to talk about is edge flow. Edge flow describes how the mesh is organized, how neat it looks. Things with good edge flow tend to animate better than things with bad edge flow. But more than that, they look more presentable, they look professional, and they can help provide a lot of ease to the other aspects of 3D animation. And to demonstrate edge flow, I'm going to bring you back into Maya to sort of show you an example of what I mean by this. You can see we have 2 objects in here, one on the left and one on the right. One of them has a much cleaner edge flow, whereas the other one has a much more chaotic and destructive edge flow. And I've set up a little rig here to sort of demonstrate what I mean, what happens whenever you have a bad edge flow versus a good one. If we move this knee down, and you see it start to deform a little bit. Now the back of the knee could probably use a little work, but as you can see from the front, it looks relatively clean, and the deformation is nice, and that's something we can very much work with at the animation level. It's totally usable. Whereas something on the other side here with a bad edge flow, you can see a lot of the mistakes within the mesh itself start to make themselves apparent as we move or deform the mesh. And so the reason we don't want bad edge flow is so that we can avoid animation issues like this, animation and rigging issues. Alright, next let's talk about z-fighting and lamina faces. Z-fighting is when 2 powerful sands Z-fighting is when 2 faces attempt to occupy the same space at the same time. And I'm actually going to show you an example of this in Maya. Okay, so we're going to go in here to Maya, and I'm going to show an example of Z-fighting. Now, if we select a face here, and then we extrude from that face, and then we leave it there, you see nothing really looks wrong, but the extrusion tool creates another face on top of that. So if we try and move this around, you're going to see this nasty visual artifact start to happen. And this is what happens when two faces are trying to occupy the same space at the same time. We get all kinds of weird conflicts, and the renderer doesn't know what to do with it. Unless you give it some depth, it really has no way to interpret that you've created a unique face. So there are a number of different ways you can go about fixing this, but for this video, I'm not really going to go into it. I'll probably cover that in a video about extruding. Whoops. A lamina face is basically what this is right here, except all the edges are shared between the two faces that are overlapping. Lamina faces don't really show the same artifacts all the time as Z-fighting, so they're a little bit harder to spot, but there are tools to help you get rid of those, and again, I'll go over those at a different point. Next, let's talk about everyone's favorite subject, which is ngons. Now, whenever you're polymodeling, you need to make sure that each of your polygons has only 4 or fewer sides, so you can have it made up of triangles, or you can have it made up of these 4-sided polygons. Anything larger than that is called an ngon, and in the industry, ngons are kind of controversial. Some people can make them work, but for the most part, you don't want them anywhere in your mesh. The reasons for this are that there's a lot of them. They can cause issues with rendering. They can cause issues with animation. If you're putting it into a game engine, that can cause some issues. And the reason for that tends to fall down to the fact that the mathematics used within these engines and within these 3D programs tend to rely on geometry made of either triangles or polygons. A lot of the times, if you try and use one of the functions that relies on this type of geometry, it probably just won't work. For example, there's a insert edge loop tool, which allows you to create these sort of cuts in the geometry in Maya, but it won't work quite right if you have an ngon somewhere. So you have to be really careful to not have them in your geometry. Otherwise, you could start running into some pretty serious issues. Now, I just want to clarify, it's not illegal to use ngons. It is totally possible to create a decent looking mesh using ngons, but it is not ideal for most of the processes that we need whenever we're in these 3D engines. Probably the least serious issue on this list is the edge pole. An edge pole basically describes a point where 5 or more edges meet on a mesh. Now, at face value, this doesn't seem problematic because if you have polygons all around the edges, then there's really no issue, right? Well, if we're dealing with something like the human face, where we need nice edge loops around the mouth and around the eyes to get the correct deformation out of the face, these edge poles can actually create sort of like a point where these things converge, and it can create some ugly looking animation effects, which we don't want. So while if you have edge poles within your geometry, it's not going to break the model, but it will result in lower quality animation around the face. So it's best to try and reroute these as best as possible. Alright, the last concept I want to touch on this list is the poly count. Now, this is more subjective. This is probably the most subjective thing on this list. Some people prefer lower poly counts, some people prefer higher poly counts. But basically, again, at face value, this is just how many polygons your mesh has. Depending on what your needs are, you might need more polygons. Like if you're going for a more realistic look, chances are you're going to have a lot of polygons. There's not much you can do about that. It depends. It really just depends on what your project is. You know, if you have a low poly thing, then you're going to want fewer polygons. Some companies will set sort of limits on how many polygons you can have in a mesh, but most of the time it's sort of up to your discretion. So bringing this back around to topology, there are a lot of different things that can make a topology good, and there are a lot of different things that can make it bad. Typically, a good topology will have good edge flow, minimal Z-fighting, minimal ngons, and as few edge poles as you can manage. Whereas a bad topology will have bad edge flow, will have examples of Z-fighting, and will probably have a lot of ngons in it, along with edge poles. And depending on your project, the topology can either have high poly counts or low poly counts. Again, just depends on your needs. Alright, last of the terms, I promise. Now we're just going to go over the various parts of the 3D process from beginning to end. Everything I've described here is just has to do with modeling, and actually I recommend you stay there for a while just to sort of get it under your fingertips and understand how models are made. But after this process, we move into something called texturing. So remember earlier when I said that faces tend to have this information tied to it that displays surface detail. Basically, the process of texturing is manipulating that detail to whatever suits your needs. I'll be going more in depth with this in a later video, but understand that every face on your mesh corresponds to another face on a 2D plane. This plane doesn't have X, Y, or Z attached to it, but we call it the UV plane. And we use this plane to project 2D images over the mesh, which then wraps itself back around the mesh to create the illusion of a texture. This face can come pretty much anywhere after the modeling process, but I recommend you do it right before you do your animation or rigging. And what rigging is you're preparing a model for animation. Now, there are two types of rigging in my mind, there are two types of rigging that you can do. You can do skeletal rigging, which utilizes bones or joints, depending on your software, to bind itself to your mesh and influence the vertices around it to create movement. Control rigging is where you're essentially creating tools for the animator to make their life easier. Unless you've done some animation yourself, it's a little hard to know why that might be necessary, but once we get into it, you'll probably understand a little bit better why it is we need to do something like that. The step after that is animation. So you're using the rig that you created in order to distort the mesh in such a way as to create movement and life and breathe all this sort of energy into it, this organic flow that people enjoy watching on a screen. This is typically accomplished using either motion capture or keyframe animation. And again, keyframe animation is something I'll be showing a little bit later in this process. I'm not very familiar with mocap, so that probably won't be covered. Really, the step after animation, after you've got all your stuff done, is just making it pretty. This can be accomplished through rendering. Rendering is a process that applies all these outside effects to the scene that you've created. This can add the addition of lighting. This can add like all kinds of emitting effects. It allows you to do post-processing and perform all these really interesting visual tasks on the scene that you've created to make it look good. Unfortunately, this process also is very time-consuming and very taxing on your hardware, so it can be a little cost prohibitive depending on your needs. However, it's totally possible to do this if you know how to optimize your scene well. And the last term is just a general term, but it's one that you ought to know. It's pipeline. And basically a pipeline just describes the chain of processes or programs that you use in order to accomplish a task. And this is going to change for whatever task you're trying to do. If you're making models for games, then chances are your process is going to look a little something like create the model in Maya, do all your rigging, do some animation in there, maybe create some textures in Substance Painter, and then when it's ready for rendering, it could do like a cutscene or something in Keyshot or Arnold or V-Ray. Or maybe you just want to take the model and put it right into Unity or Unreal and just have it be a game asset from that point on. Really, it just depends on what your needs are. But regardless of what those needs are, know that it's probably a good idea before you start to take the time and figure out what programs are you going to need in order to get your job done. And on the topic of programs, let's move into this next section where we figure out what type of program you need to use or would be interested in using. So you have quite a few options. Unfortunately, as far as 3D programs go, a lot of them tend to be very cost prohibitive. Everything on here except Blender is going to require some kind of subscription or fee. I use Maya most of the time, but I have a license through the university I attend right now. I intend to learn Blender at some point just to sort of give myself a backup, but for the majority of the videos you see on this channel, I'll probably be working with Maya. And Maya is really good for a lot of industry acceptable animation. It's used a lot in games alongside 3ds Max, which is also very, very well supported program. It has lots of background features and things that you need to essentially get your job done right. Now, the next one is Cinema 4D. This one's it's kind of tricky to use and has very limited modeling capabilities, so if you're just learning modeling, I probably wouldn't start out with that. What it is great at, though, is motion graphics. Like, it excels at that. It's the industry, it's the competitive one, right? You want to use this for your motion graphics. It's very good for that. I have a friend who uses it, but most of the time it's really complicated. There's so many plugins she has to use, and it's just not very intuitive for a beginner, I think. So I might start with one of the other programs before trying to venture into that one. Next up is Houdini, which is also a little quirky. It has a node-based system in order to construct geometry, which is a very strange way of going about it. Again, if you're just starting out with poly modeling, I wouldn't recommend trying that first. What Houdini is really good at is visual effects, though. If you need visual effects, that is the one-stop shop. You go to Houdini. You can do it in InGen, but you can do it better in Houdini. It's not even that much of a question. But again, it can be cost prohibitive. It's not easy to get your hands on. So if you have to do it in InGen, just do it there. But if you can, try to get your hands on that. Now, I don't know much about Modo, but from what I can see and what I've heard from other sources is that Modo is very good for creating quick renders. Like, it's really good for just throwing a bunch of assets in and just creating a render out of it. It's speedy, it gets your job done quick, and if you're willing to sort of play around with that, it might be an option to explore. And last up, we have the man, the myth, the legend itself, Blender. Blender is controversial in a lot of ways. In the industry, it's not used a lot, but as far as hobbyists go and as far as indie developers go, it's one of the most used programs out there, which doesn't surprise me that much. Like, it can do just about anything you need it to do. The problem is that companies aren't really taking it into standard use. I don't know why they don't do it, but that just seems to be the case as of right now. I would still highly, highly recommend starting with Blender if you're on a budget, if you've never done this before, if you can't afford or get a license to any of the other ones, start with Blender. That's going to be your best bet. And I'll admit the UI isn't particularly user-friendly to beginners, but if you manage to learn it, again, it's totally worth it, and it's probably going to be free for the rest of our lives. So I would definitely pick up that one if you're just starting out and have nothing else to work with. Beyond that, what is there to really say? 3D modeling is a very, very rewarding practice if you give the time and the care that it deserves. I've been learning it for about 2.5, 3 years now, and honestly, I still feel like I'm a beginner. Like, that feeling doesn't really go away ever, but I've learned quite a lot, and I want to sort of share a lot of that information with people out there, because all the good tutorials and all the good information on the internet right now seems to be restricted to, or seems to be locked behind paywalls and subscriptions to other services, and it's very, very monetized right now. So really the goal of this channel is to help give you some of that high-level information without making you break the budget or the bank or anything like that. But some parting wisdom is practice a lot. Practice as much as you can. Something I used to do was I used to pick out something in my room every day, and I would just model it. You'd be surprised how many things around you are sort of made of basic shapes and very easily workable geometry. It's surprising, and I did that every day, and it helped me become a lot better at modeling. So practice as much as you can. Second, watch videos, not just mine, but get as much information as you can, like absorb it. See everything that you can, sort of get every little morsel of information that you can squeeze out of the internet, because really that's where a lot of the information is right now. Take it from someone who went to a school for game design that basically crashed and burned. You can't really trust a lot of the institutions at the moment, just simply because the practice of this is so new, and there are so few people who really understand how it ought to be taught. So it's not really worth investing in that a lot of the time. So really, the internet's your best friend here. Make as much use of it as you can. Go to forums, watch videos, go to people's websites, reach out to people. You would not believe how many times I've reached out to someone on like a video, or the creator of like a plugin that I used once. How many times I've reached out to those people and just had them respond. Like, they're just human beings. They want to help you, and they will help you if you ask nicely. Don't be an asshole, but use the internet to your benefit. And last, of course, take breaks. Especially if you're looking for a job in the field, there are a lot of people who are going to tell you that the only way to get a job is to be relentlessly obsessive about your modeling and about improving your practice. And while to an extent I agree, you do need to be improving, don't make it your entire life if you can help it. go outside, go find some inspiration, go have those life experiences that will turn you into the kind of person who will use 3D to create things no one has ever seen. It's not a race, and there is no time limit. So have fun with it. See what you can make. Challenge yourself, create some interesting ideas for you to explore, and then see how far you can get with them. And if it's any consolation, I'll be here to help you along the way. There will be multiple series coming up. I'll probably start with the basics of modeling series and then work through the entire pipeline. So we'll be starting with modeling and going into texturing, going into rigging, animation, and then rendering and exporting to whatever file format you might need. So keep an eye out for those. It's probably going to take a while. I have a lot of different things going on right now, but keep an eye out for them. And until next time, my name is Nicholas Furman, and hopefully this has helped you understand the basics of 3D hard surface modeling. So good luck, and peace out.